The next type of factoring is factoring trinomials. When we factor trinomials, we have the ability to solve those trinomials. We'll deal with that later. It also allows us to find interesting things, an x-intercept. It'll allow us to factor, well, obviously factoring. It'll also allow us to help graph. So we'll be doing some work with factoring of trinomials. Now in this part, when we have a trinomial, so if we look at the basic form of ax squared plus bx plus c, this first term, this highest power term, is going to be 1. It might not be 1 initially. We may have to do a greatest common factor for it, but it will be 1. Later, when we'll have factors where a will be something other than 1, and there'll be some methods that we can use to solve that. So one of the things that's helpful is to remember how we got to where we're going. Remember, factoring is undoing multiplication. So if we have a simple pair of binomials, we know that we can FOIL these. We take the x times the x times the 4, the minus 6 times the x, and the minus 6 times the 4. So you'll notice that I placed that down below as we have done in class. So we have x squared plus 4x, that's the first set of multiplications, minus 6x, and minus 24. So what I want you to look at, though, when we do these, there's a couple of things that we're actually accomplishing. If we look at this first term, that first term we multiply, so we're just going to use a multiplication. In the third term, we did the same thing, we multiplied. This middle term is a little more complicated. The first pair of operations was multiplication. That's how we got the 4x and the minus 6. And then we added. So in this instance, we take the 4x plus minus 6x. And that gives us a minus 2x. So when we work with factoring, we want to look at how do we get the first term, how do we get the third term, just simply multiplication. And then we look at the middle term. And the middle term we get by doing two things, multiplying and adding. Now the thing to remember, when we multiply different signs, we actually are doing, in essence, 3 types of multiplication. And I'm writing them down here. We have a minus times a minus, a plus times a plus, and a plus times a minus. Now technically we have a minus times a plus, but really the same thing. So the first two, when we multiply those two together, we're going to get a positive. Now this is important because, again, when we get this middle term, we multiply and we add. And in the third example, when we multiply a positive and a negative number, we get a negative. So that'll become very important as we start working with some of these problems. So if we come down here to the next one, we have 3 simple examples here. And the first one, b squared plus 8b plus 7. And to get this, we know that we have to multiply 2 binomials. And so to get a b squared, there's only one way to get that, a b times a b. So as you work with factoring trinomials, especially the simple ones like we're doing with this video, you want to look at and you want to analyze how you got the first term and how you get the third term. And you just want to build on it. There's really 3 parts. So now if we look at the signs, the plus 7, there are 2 ways that we can get a plus 7. We know that we can multiply 2 positives. We also know that we can multiply 2 negatives. Well, then we have to decide, well, which one are we going to choose? That's when we look at the sign of the middle term. And since that's positive, we have to multiply 2 positives. So we know that b plus something and b plus something. Then we have to look at 7. And there's only one way to get a 7. That's 1 times 7. And we know that we're going to add these. because we get that middle term. Once we get the middle term, we get the middle term by multiplying and adding. And so we know that these are going to have to be 1 and 7. And if we check it, we know that we have b squared plus 7b, that's the first set of multiplications, plus b plus 7. And then if we simplify, we get what we started with. If we got anything else, then we didn't factor correctly. Okay, the next one, we have 2k squared plus 22k plus 60. Now the first thing you want to look at is that first term. It would be nice if that was a 1. Fortunately, each of these are even, so we can factor out a 2. So then we get a k squared plus 11k plus 30. So now what we're going to be looking at is 2 times a pair of binomials. And so if we look at this the same way we did it before, we want to look at that first term. There's only one way to get a k squared, and that's k times k. We look at the sign. We notice that this is a plus 30, and we also know that this is a plus 11. So we know that we're going to be working with 2 additions. Well, now we got to look at the factors of 30. The factors are, what numbers do we multiply together to get 30? And we know we're going to do 1 times 30, 2 times 15, 3 times 10. Now, you don't have to write these down, but I'll tell you that helps you a lot. And 5 times 6. Now we know to get the middle term, we're doing 2 operations. We are multiplying and we're adding. And the only one that'll give us 11 is this bottom one. So then this will be k plus 5 and k plus 6. So we know that if we do a quick little multiplication, we get k times k, that gives us k squared. K times 6, that's 6k, plus 5 times k, that's 5k, that gives us 11k. So yep, we got that okay. And then 5 times 6 gives us 30, so we're okay. All right, and the last one. Now, notice that when you factor this, let's go back to this one, the answer is 2 times these 2 binomials. Don't lose that 2. If you do the homework and you miss that, you're going to be wrong, because that 2 does play a big part in this factor. So the next one we can factor out a 6. So that leaves us v squared plus 11v plus 10. And so to factor these, we know that we're going to use 2 pairs of binomials, and we're going to have v times v. We're also dealing with positives. And there's only 2 ways to get a 10. And again, you don't have to write them down, but sometimes if you're not finding any numbers that give you the middle, sometimes just writing them out actually makes that possible. So the only thing that we can do is the 1 and the 10, and that'll give us 11 in the middle, and that would be the factors for this. Now, we're not always going to deal with positives. Sometimes you're going to have negatives. So if we look at this first one, we have v squared minus 7v plus 10. Don't have to factor anything out. Now this first thing was a minus v squared. I would factor the minus out. So we know that we're going to have a pair of binomials. There's only one way to get a v, so it's v times v. Now, to get this positive, we know that we're multiplying a positive times a positive, or a negative times a negative. Well, to determine which we use, we look at the middle term. And you'll see that we have a negative there. So this tells us that we're going to be multiplying by 2 negatives. And 10, we know that the 2 factors are 1 times 10. and 2 times 5. So the only one that gives us 7, again, the signs are the same, so we're adding. So it's 2 and 5. Okay. The next one, again, we're going to be a pair of binomials. We know that we're dealing with an x and an x. But now we have to look at the signs. In this one, we notice the sign is negative, and there's only one way to get a negative, and that's a negative times a positive. So we have a negative and a positive. What you put first does not matter as long as you have the right number associated with it. Now to get a 12, to multiply to get a 12, it's 1 times 12, 2 times 6, and 3 times 4. Now we know we're still adding, but we're adding different signs, so really the operation will be subtraction. So if we subtract the first one, we have 11. That doesn't give us the middle term. If we subtract the second one, we get 4. Subtract the last one, we're going to get 1. So when the signs are the same, like the first one here, we know that we're adding. So we're adding 1 and 10 gives us 11, 2 and 5 gives us 7, which was our term. So in this one, we know that we're going to have 3 and 4. Well, now we have to decide, is it a negative 3 times a positive 4, or a positive 3 times a negative 4? Well, we know if we do 4 minus 3, that gives us 1. Well, that's our middle term. But let's look at the next one. Minus 4 plus 3 gives us minus 1. So we know that the 3 will be negative and the 4 will be positive. And you have to play with these a little bit and work with these a little bit. So what I normally like to do is just find the factors. I know to get these, we are going to subtract. So we're going to subtract here. In the first example, we know that we're going to add. And so then you use these to find out whether or not it's a 1 or a minus 1, or 4 or minus 4, or 11 and minus 11. And then, once you find the middle term, then you can decide how to set up your factors. Now the last one, we can again set up our binomial. We know it's going to be x times x. We know to get a negative here, we have to do a negative and a positive. So we know that we're going to be subtracting to get that middle term. Well, there's only one way to get a 7, and that's 1 times 7. And if we subtract these, we're going to get 6. Well, that's not the middle term. So this particular problem is you can't factor it. So the correct answer here is prime. Now what I want you to remember is just because something is prime does not mean that it's not solvable. It just means that we can't use factoring as a means of solving. So these simple trinomials where the first term is 1 after factoring out greatest common factor is really by trial and error. You set up your binomials. After you set up your binomials, then you start filling in. And you don't want to give up early. Just keep playing with the various numbers until you find it. Be very helpful. So that is factoring simple trinomials.